There are moments in life that do not arrive with noise. They do not knock loudly. They do not announce themselves. They come quietly, so quietly that many people miss them. It was one of those moments. Nothing dramatic had happened. The day looked the same as any other. Words were spoken, smiles were shared, and the world moved on as it always does. Yet somewhere inside, something shifted. A feeling passed through him, soft but unmistakable, like a breeze moving through a still room. Have you ever felt that sudden stillness inside, even while everything around you continues as usual? He could not explain it. There was no clear reason. No single moment he could point to and say, "This is where it began." But his heart grew quiet in a way it had never been before. Not peaceful. Not yet. Just quiet, heavy, watchful. He noticed how his words felt different as they left his mouth, how laughter sounded farther away, how familiar faces seemed just slightly out of reach. It was as if a thin veil had fallen between him and the world, not to separate but to slow everything down. And in that slowing, something uncomfortable appeared. A question. Why does this feel wrong? He tried to ignore it. Most people do. It is easier to keep moving, to keep speaking, to keep filling the air with sound. Silence can be unsettling. Silence leaves room for thoughts we are not always ready to face. So he did what he had always done. He stayed kind. He stayed open. He trusted. Trust had always felt like the right thing to do. It felt generous. It felt human. But that quiet feeling remained. At night, when the world softened and voices faded, it returned. Not as fear, not as anger, just a steady presence sitting beside him, waiting. Is something being asked of me, or is something being taken? He remembered small moments that suddenly felt larger, a glance that lingered too long, a pause in conversation that felt empty, words that sounded warm but carried a strange weight underneath. Nothing obvious, nothing certain. And yet, the silence inside him grew deeper. There is a kind of silence that comes from peace, and there is another kind that comes from awareness. This was the second kind. He began to listen more than he spoke, not because he decided to, but because something within him leaned toward stillness, as if a door had closed gently, not to shut the world out, but to protect something fragile inside. He watched how people spoke when they thought no one was paying attention. How tone changed, how intentions revealed themselves in small careless moments. And slowly, without any clear beginning, he understood one thing. Trust does not always break loudly. Sometimes it cracks in silence. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no sharp endings, just a quiet knowing settling into his chest. The kind that does not rush and cannot be argued with. It did not make him angry. It made him still, and in that stillness he realized something important. This moment was not about them, it was about him, about how he would respond to what his heart had already seen. Would he speak? Would he react? Or would he listen to the silence that had arrived for a reason? The world around him continued unaware, but inside everything had slowed to a gentle pause, a pause before a choice, a pause before understanding. Some moments change us not by what happens next, but by what stops happening. And this was one of those moments. The quiet did not leave him. It stayed, settling deeper, like a weight that could not be seen but was always felt. During the day he carried it with him. During the night, it sat beside him, not pressing, not demanding, just present, a silent companion that refused to be ignored. It was strange how something without shape could feel so heavy. He noticed it most when he was alone, when there was no one watching, no one listening, no one expecting anything from him. That was when the weight revealed itself, not as pain, but as restraint, as if his heart wanted to speak, yet chose not to. Have you ever felt that kind of holding back? That quiet effort of keeping yourself steady while something inside you stirs. He felt it in his chest, slow and constant. Words formed in his mind, but they stopped before reaching his lips. Emotions rose, then gently folded back into themselves. Not because he was afraid, but because reacting suddenly felt wrong. too fast, too careless. The silence asked him to wait. Waiting is not easy. It stretches time. It makes moments feel longer than they are. It brings thoughts closer, sometimes too close. Thoughts we usually keep busy enough to avoid. He began to notice how often he had filled space before, how quickly he used to answer, how easily he offered explanations, understanding, forgiveness. And now, doing none of that felt heavy, like carrying water in open hands, careful not to spill. Why does restraint feel heavier than action? Why does silence demand more strength than words? The weight grew when he remembered moments that now felt different. Things he once brushed aside returned with new meaning. Not accusing, not dramatic, just clearer. Small gestures replayed themselves slowly, as if asking him to look again. He did not feel the need to confront. He did not feel the need to defend himself. What he felt was something quieter, a sense of responsibility, not toward others, but toward his own inner balance. He realized how often people mistake silence for weakness. But this silence was not empty. It was full of thought, full of restraint, full of careful watching. Still, it was not comfortable. There were moments when he wished the quiet would break, when he wished something would force clarity, force words, force an ending. Because carrying unspoken awareness is tiring. It sits in the body. It slows the breath. It changes the way the heart beats. Yet the silence remained gentle. It did not push him. It did not rush him. It simply stayed, as if trusting him to understand when the time was right. At times he wondered if he was being unfair, if he was holding too much inside, if the weight was of his own making. These questions came softly, without judgment. Am I protecting myself, or am I hiding? The silence did not answer. It never does. It only reveals what is already there. He noticed how this quiet changed the way he listened. He heard pauses in other voices. He sensed what was left unsaid. He began to understand that words are often the smallest part of what is being shared. And that understanding added to the weight, because once you see more, you cannot unsee it. Once you feel the truth beneath the surface, pretending becomes harder, louder, heavier. The silence was no longer just absence of sound. It became a space where his self-respect slowly gathered itself, where emotions were not denied but held with care. This was not peace yet. This was discipline being formed quietly, a kind of inner training that no one else could see. And as the days passed, he understood something subtle. This weight was not there to break him. It was there to teach him the cost of reacting too quickly and the value of holding still when the heart needs time. Some lessons do not arrive as answers. They arrive as weight. And only those who carry it without complaint begin to understand what it is shaping within them. It was not the silence that hurt the most. It was what grew around it. They began to speak in ways that felt unfamiliar. Their words sounded certain, even when they did not know. Their tone carried conclusions he had never been invited to share. It was as if a story was being told about him quietly without his presence. He noticed it in small ways at first, a change in how they looked at him, a pause where warmth used to be, questions that were never asked, but somehow already answered. Have you ever felt that strange distance that appears when people think they understand you, but do not? He stood close enough to hear, yet far enough to feel unseen. What they believed was shaped not by truth, but by fragments, a moment taken out of place, a silence misunderstood, a kindness mistaken for something else. He wondered when it had started, or if it had always been there waiting for the right quiet moment to surface. There was a time when he would have spoken, when he would have explained himself gently, believing that clarity always brings peace. He would have chosen the right words, softened his voice, and trusted that honesty would be enough. But now, something held him back, because he realized that being misunderstood does not always come from a lack of explanation. Sometimes it comes from their refusal to listen. They did not ask how he felt. They did not wonder why he had grown quieter. Instead, they filled the space themselves with assumptions, with stories that made sense to them. And in that, he felt a subtle kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being present and still not known. It hurt more than he expected. He felt the urge to correct them, to defend his intentions, to show them the care that still lived in him. The effort it took to remain gentle, the discipline it took to remain silent. But another thought followed closely behind. Would they hear me, or would they only hear what they already believe? This question stayed with him. It sat quietly, heavier than anger, steadier than fear, and the longer he held it, the clearer something became. Not every misunderstanding is meant to be resolved. Some exist to reveal where your voice no longer belongs. He watched how easily people speak about things they do not fully see, how quickly certainty forms without depth, how silence, when misunderstood, becomes an empty space they rush to fill. And still, he did not speak. This choice did not come from pride. It came from something deeper, a sense that explaining himself would cost more than it would give, that offering truth to closed ears only leads to exhaustion. They mistook his quiet for distance. They mistook his restraint for coldness. But he knew the truth. His silence was full of care, full of thought, full of a desire not to harm the fragile balance within him. Being misunderstood changes a person. It sharpens awareness. It teaches what air energy is wasted and where it is preserved. It shows how often we speak not to be heard, but to be accepted. He felt the ache of it settle into his chest. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a steady reminder that connection requires willingness on both sides. And when that willingness is missing, silence becomes a form of self-respect. There were moments when he doubted himself, when he wondered if staying quiet made him part of the misunderstanding, if his restraint was being read as indifference, but deep down, he knew. Speaking without being heard creates noise, not understanding, so he chose to observe instead, to listen not just to words but to intentions, to see how easily people reveal themselves when they believe no one is watching. And in that quiet observation, he learned something valuable. Being misunderstood by those who do not seek truth is not a failure. It is a boundary forming gently. The world did not change. They did not suddenly see him differently, but something inside him grew steadier, less shaken by opinions, less eager to correct every false idea. He realized that clarity does not always come from speaking. Sometimes it comes from allowing others to reveal how deeply they are willing to understand. And in that understanding, he stood quietly, carrying his truth without needing to place it in their hands. The change did not arrive all at once. It came in a pause, a small, almost unnoticeable pause between feeling and response. In what rose inside him and what he allowed to leave him. In that pause, something shifted quietly, like a door opening without a sound. He began to notice it when familiar moments appeared again. A look, a word, a silence that once would have pulled a reaction from him. This time, it did not. The feeling still came, but it stopped short of becoming action. And in that stopping, he felt something new, space. Have you ever noticed how much room there is when you do not rush to answer? How thoughts settle when they are not pushed? He realized that before he had moved too quickly. Not out of weakness, but out of habit. He believed that understanding required immediate response. That silence needed to be filled. That calm came from resolving things quickly. But this pause showed him something different. The pause allowed him to see his emotions without being ruled by them. He could feel disappointment without letting it harden. He could feel sadness without letting it spill outward. He could feel confusion without needing to explain it away. This was not numbness. This was awareness. In the quiet space of that pause, he began to understand the difference between reaction and choice. Reaction is fast. It seeks relief. It wants to release what it feels. Choice is slower. It listens first. It considers what will remain after the moment passes. The pause became a place where his dignity rested. He noticed how often reaction creates echoes. Words spoken too quickly linger, longer than intended. Emotions released without care return in unexpected ways. The pause protected him from those echoes. At first it felt unnatural, like holding his breath just a moment longer than usual. There was discomfort in it, a sense of pressure. But beneath that pressure there was steadiness. The pause did not silence him. It refined him. He became less interested in winning understanding and more interested in preserving balance, less focused on how he appeared and more aware of how he felt afterward. What remains after I speak? What remains after I stay quiet? These questions began to guide him gently without force. He noticed that not every moment asked for his voice. Some moments asked only for his presence, his attention, his restraint. In choosing the pause, he also began to see others more clearly. He saw how quickly they reacted, how their words often outran their thoughts, how certainty often masked uncertainty, and he felt no need to correct them. The pause gave him a strange kind of freedom. Freedom from needing to prove, freedom from defending intentions that were never questioned by those who truly mattered. There was a quiet strength in knowing he could speak but did not have to. This realization did not make him distant. It made him grounded. He remained kind. He remained open. But he no longer offered immediate access to his inner world. Some things deserve time before being shared. Some truths deserve silence before words. The pause became a teacher. It showed him that power does not announce itself. It settles, it listens, it waits until movement is necessary. He began to trust this stillness, to see it not as avoidance, but as wisdom forming slowly. He felt himself changing, not in how he appeared, but in how deeply he felt anchored within. The world did not notice the pause, but he did, and that was enough, because in that small space between feeling and response, he discovered something lasting, a calm authority that did not need volume, a clarity that did not need explanation. The pause did not remove the pain of being misunderstood. It did not erase the weight he carried, but it taught him how to carry it without being pulled apart by it. And in that quiet pause, his inner voice grew clearer than any sound around him. Silence began to show him things he had not seen before, not all at once, not clearly, but slowly, like a reflection forming on still water. The quieter he became, the more the world around him revealed itself without effort. He noticed how they behaved when he no longer reacted, how their words lingered in the air, unanswered, how some sentences lost their strength when they were not met with emotion. It was strange. Without his response, their certainty seemed less certain. Have you ever watched what happens when you do not give people what they expect? Silence has a way of doing that. It does not argue. It does not defend. It simply stands there, calm and unmoving. And in doing so, it reflects. He began to see intentions more clearly. Not because they explained themselves, but because they did not. When there was no reaction to push against, what remained was truth, exposed in small gestures and quiet pauses. Some grew uncomfortable, some grew louder, some revealed patience they never showed before, and some, without realizing it, revealed themselves. This was not something he planned. He did not use silence as a tool. He simply stayed still, and the stillness did the work on its own. He noticed how often people speak to provoke a response, how words are sometimes thrown forward, not to be understood, but to feel power over the moment. When that power is not returned, something shifts. Silence removes the stage, and without a stage, many performances end. He saw how they filled the quiet with explanations he never asked for, how they adjusted their tone, how they tested boundaries gently, then more firmly, waiting to see if he would move, but he did not. Inside, something steady held him in place. Not pride, not bitterness, just awareness. A quiet understanding that reacting would give away something he no longer wished to offer. What he offered instead was presence. And presence, when paired with silence, becomes a mirror. In that mirror, he also saw himself. He saw how often he had reacted in the past, how easily emotions once guided his words, how much energy he had given to moments that did not deserve it. This realization did not bring regret. It brought clarity. Silence showed him where his power had always been leaking. It was not in what he said, it was in what he chose not to say. As he stayed quiet, his inner world grew louder in a different way. Thoughts became clearer. Feelings became easier to identify without being overwhelming. He could sit with discomfort without needing to escape it. That too was a reflection. Silence showed him that strength does not rush, it observes, it waits until truth settles. He noticed how his self-respect deepened without effort. He did not need to assert it. He did not need to explain it. It simply existed, quietly shaping how he stood, how he listened, how he responded when response was truly needed. They may not have understood his silence. Some may have mistaken it for distance or indifference or uncertainty, but that no longer mattered as much. Because silence was no longer empty to him. It was full of understanding. He understood that not every truth needs to be spoken to be real. Not every feeling needs to be shared to be honored. Some things grow stronger when they are kept close. The mirror of silence showed him something else too. That inner power is not loud. It does not announce itself. It becomes visible only when noise fades. And in that quiet visibility, he felt grounded. He was no longer measuring himself against their reactions. He was no longer adjusting his tone to be received. He was simply present, rooted in what he knew, steady in what he felt. Silence did not change who he was. It revealed who he had always been beneath the noise. And once he saw that reflection clearly, he knew he could not turn away from it, because some truths, once seen in still water, remain with you forever. There came a moment when he understood that not explaining himself was a choice. At first, this realization felt uncomfortable. He had always believed that clarity came from words, that understanding could be built if he spoke gently enough, carefully enough. Explaining felt like kindness, like effort, like proof of good intent. But now he saw something else. Each explanation asked him to open a door that did not always deserve to be opened. Each justification required him to step forward, even when he felt steady where he stood. So he stopped, not suddenly, not sharply, just quietly. Have you ever noticed how much energy it takes to explain yourself to someone who is not truly listening? He felt it then. The lightness that came from not carrying that burden anymore. The relief of not shaping his truth into words meant for uncertain ears. Silence, in this way, became a form of care, not toward them but toward himself. He noticed how often explanations were misunderstood, how words meant to soften only added new edges, how the more he spoke, the more space there was for interpretation, distortion, and doubt. By not explaining, he left no room for that. This was not about secrecy, it was out dignity. There is a quiet dignity in knowing who you are without needing agreement, in holding your truth steady even when it is not reflected back to you. He felt this dignity settle into him slowly. It changed how he stood in moments of tension. He no longer leaned forward, searching for acceptance. He remained still, trusting that what mattered would not be lost in silence. They noticed the change. Some seemed confused by it. They waited for him to speak, to correct, to reassure. When he did not, they filled the space themselves, with guesses, with assumptions, with discomfort. And still he remained quiet. Not cold, not distant, just whole. There is a strength in not explaining that few understand. It requires patience. It requires trust in oneself. It requires the courage to let misunderstandings exist without rushing to erase them. Because not every misunderstanding threatens your worth. He began to see how self-respect grows when it is not defended, how it stands taller when it is not argued for, how it becomes solid when it is lived, not spoken. This did not mean he never spoke again. It meant he spoke with intention, with care, with awareness of when words were necessary and when silence served better. What deserves my voice? What deserves my quiet? These questions guided him now. He felt less drained after interactions, less scattered, less pulled in many directions. His energy stayed closer to him, no longer stretched thin by the need to be understood by everyone. There was peace in that, not the loud kind, the steady kind, the kind that allows you to rest in yourself. He realized that explaining often comes from fear. Fear of being seen wrongly, fear of being judged, fear of being left. But he was no longer afraid in the same way. He trusted that those who truly wished to understand would find their way without force, and those who did not were not meant to hold his inner world. This understanding did not harden him. It softened him, because he no longer carried resentment. He no longer felt the need to prove his goodness. He simply lived it. And in that quiet living, something strong took root. Self-respect does not ask to be noticed. It does not ask to be confirmed. It exists, steady and unmoved. He felt it in his breath, in his stillness. In the calm way he met the world without explanation. The silence around him was no longer a gap to be filled. It was a boundary, gentle but firm, a space where his inner balance could remain untouched. And as he rested there, he understood something deeply true. You do not owe everyone an explanation. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for yourself is to remain silent and let your life speak in its own time. Something quiet began to grow inside him, unnoticed by the world around him. It did not announce itself. It did not rush forward. It grew the way roots grow in dark soil, slowly, without needing attention. This growth came from restraint. Each time he chose not to react, something settled deeper within him. Each time he allowed a moment to pass without response, he felt a subtle strengthening, like standing still while a strong wind moves past you instead of through you. Have you ever noticed how much changes when you stop feeding every feeling with action? At first, the restraint felt like effort, like holding a door closed against pressure. But over time, it felt different. The pressure lessened. The door stayed closed on its own. Silence no longer felt heavy. It felt spacious. Within that space, his thoughts became clearer. He could feel emotions without being carried away by them. Sadness came and went. Disappointment passed through. Even moments of quiet hurt softened faster than before. Because he did not resist them, and he did not release them carelessly. He simply allowed them to move through him. This is how growth happens when no one is watching. He noticed that his reactions were no longer sharp. When words came, they were fewer and calmer. When silence came, it no longer felt tense. It felt natural. There was a sense of inner order forming, a balance between feeling deeply and responding wisely. He was not becoming distant from the world. He was becoming closer to himself. He saw how restraint protected his energy, how it kept him from being pulled into unnecessary struggles, how it saved him from carrying emotions that were never his to begin with. This kind of growth does not seek validation. It does not need approval. It simply changes how you move through the world. He noticed it in small ways. How his breath stayed steady in moments that once unsettled him, how his mind no longer raced to fill silence, how he trusted stillness more than noise. This growth did not make him better than anyone. It made him more present. He understood that reacting quickly often feels powerful, but it fades just as quickly. Restraint, on the other hand, builds something lasting, something that remains when the moment has passed, what grows when nothing is said, what strengthens when nothing is proven. Inside him, patience deepened, not forced patience, but natural patience, the kind that comes from knowing you do not have to respond to everything to remain whole. He felt less urgency, less pressure to be seen a certain way, less concern over how silence might be interpreted. Because he was no longer interpreting himself through others, the growth that came from restraint felt honest, clean, uncomplicated. It was not dramatic. It did not change his life outwardly in obvious ways, but inwardly it shifted everything. He felt grounded, grounded enough to let moments pass, grounded enough to let words remain unspoken, grounded enough to trust himself. He realized that inner strength is often misunderstood. People imagine it as force, as control, as dominance. But the strength growing in him was quieter than that. It was the strength to pause, the strength to observe. E. The strength to let things unfold without interference. This strength did not harden him. It softened his edges while strengthening his center. He could feel compassion without losing balance. He could remain kind without abandoning himself. He could remain silent without shrinking. That was the growth. It came from choosing restraint again and again, not as a rule, but as a natural response to understanding. Understanding that not every feeling needs expression. Understanding that not every moment needs resolution. Understanding that peace grows when space is allowed. In the absence of noise, something meaningful took shape, a calm confidence, a steady presence, an inner power that did not need to be shown. And as this quiet growth continued, he understood that the strongest changes often happen where no one thinks to look. In silence, he no longer felt the need to announce his steps. When he moved forward now, it was quiet. Not hidden, not cautious, just unburdened. The kind of movement that does not look back to see who is watching. The silence that once felt heavy now felt like company. A steady presence walking beside him, not asking questions, not offering advice. Just there. He noticed how little he needed to say anymore, how much could be understood without words, how much strength lived in simply continuing without explanation, without resistance. Have you ever felt that kind of calm? The kind that does not rush you anywhere. There was no dramatic ending to what had happened. No final moment where everything became clear to everyone else. Life did not stop to acknowledge his inner change, and that was fine, because something inside him had already settled. He no longer replayed conversations in his mind, no longer imagined different responses, better words, clearer explanations. Those thoughts faded naturally, like echoes dissolving into open air. He had carried them long enough. Now, his attention rested on what was in front of him, on the quiet rhythm of his own presence, on the simple fact of being steady where he stood. They may still have their versions of the story, their conclusions, their beliefs. He understood now that those things no longer reached him the same way, not because he was closed, but because he was complete. There is a kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting to be understood, when you stop needing resolution from the outside, when you accept that some things end without ceremony. This peace does not feel exciting. It feels grounded. He felt it in the way his breath moved, in the way his thoughts came and went without clinging, in the way silence no longer felt like something to manage. He was not proud of his silence. He was comfortable with it, and that comfort changed everything. He could listen without absorbing. He could observe without reacting. He could walk away without carrying what was not his. This was not escape, this was release. He understood now that inner stray. Strength does not always look like standing firm. Sometimes it looks like walking forward gently without needing to turn around. The past no longer pulled at him, not because it was forgotten, but because it had taught him what it needed to teach. He trusted himself in a new way, trusted his ability to feel without breaking. trusted his ability to remain kind without losing balance, trusted his silence. The quiet was no longer a response. It was a state of being. As he moved through his days, there was a sense of alignment, a feeling that his inner world and outer steps were no longer in conflict. He did not need to explain why he had changed. He did not need to mark the moment it happened. Some changes are not meant to be named. They are meant to be lived. And so he continued, calmly, steadily, without sound, carrying his understanding lightly, carrying his self-respect gently, carrying his silence as something sacred, not heavy. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to protect, only a quiet strength that moved with him, step by step, unseen but certain. And if someone were to look closely, they might notice something different about him, not in his words but in his stillness, not in his presence but in his peace. He had learned that the strongest way forward is often the quietest one, and so he walked on without a sound, deeply at ease within himself.